You can laugh if you want, the janitor said quietly. But that sentence is not saying what you think it says. 5 minutes later, nobody in the boardroom would dare laugh again. The 42nd floor of Sterling Global headquarters looked exactly like the kind of place where billion-dollar decisions were made. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Chicago. Sunlight reflected off polished marble floors. A conference table, nearly 30 feet long, stretched through the center of the room like a runway built for power itself. Executives in tailored suits filled leather chairs while assistants moved carefully around the edges of the room, carrying tablets and reports. At the head of the table sat Victor Sterling, Billionaire founder and chief executive officer of one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America. His reputation was legendary. So was his ego. Victor glanced toward the glass doors as they opened unexpectedly. A man pushing a cleaning cart entered quietly. Nobody paid attention at first. People like Ethan Walker were invisible in places like this. Invisible until they were in the way. Ethan moved calmly between chairs, replacing trash liners and wiping fingerprints from the polished wood. At 42 years old, he carried himself with quiet confidence, though few people ever noticed. His brown work shirt was neatly pressed. His employee badge hung from a worn lanyard. His hands showed signs of years of honest work. To most people in the room, he was simply the janitor. Nothing more. Could someone get maintenance out of here? One executive muttered. Another laughed. Maybe he is joining the board meeting. A few people smiled. Ethan continued working without reacting. Years had taught him that silence was often more powerful than defense. Near the far end of the table, Claire Mitchell looked up from a stack of legal documents. Unlike the others, she watched Ethan for a moment longer. She had seen him several times in the building. Most people entered a room looking for attention. More laughter. Ethan stopped pushing the cart. No, sir. French? Victor asked. No, sir. German? No, sir. The executives laughed again. Victor smiled. Well, there goes our backup plan. Ethan nodded politely and returned to work. Claire did not laugh. She noticed something else. Ethan never looked embarrassed. Most people would have. Most people would have rushed to leave the room. Ethan simply kept doing his job. Outside the windows, clouds drifted slowly across the Chicago skyline. Inside the boardroom, tension continued building around a deal worth nearly $2 billion. Sterling Global was attempting to finalize a partnership with an international technology consortium. Months of negotiations had led to one final obstacle. A document had arrived overnight from overseas. Nobody in the room fully understood a critical sentence buried within it. Lawyers disagreed. Translators disagreed. Analysts disagreed. And until the meaning became clear, the deal remained frozen. Victor rubbed his forehead. I am tired of hearing experts tell me they are not sure. One executive nodded. We have 3 translation teams reviewing it. And none of them agree, Victor snapped. Claire looked down at the document again. The sentence sat highlighted in yellow. One sentence. One problem. One obstacle standing between the company and billions of dollars. Ethan quietly finished emptying a trash bin near the wall. As he turned toward the door, his eyes briefly passed over the projected document displayed on the large presentation screen. His pace slowed almost imperceptibly. Then he continued walking. Claire noticed. Something about that brief glance caught her attention. It lasted less than a second. Yet Ethan had reacted as though he recognized something. The meeting continued. Experts argued. Executives debated. Voices grew louder. Solutions remained elusive. Finally, Victor stood from his chair. Enough. The room fell silent. We have spent 6 hours discussing one sentence. Frustration echoed through his voice. At this point, I should ask the janitor to translate it. Laughter erupted once more. Ethan had nearly reached the door when Victor called out. Wait. The room quieted. Ethan turned. Victor smiled. Humor me. More executives chuckled. Claire watched carefully. Something told her this moment was about to become far more important than anyone realized. Victor pointed toward the giant screen displaying the mysterious sentence. Take a look. Maybe you see something our experts missed. The room laughed again. Ethan stood still for a moment. Then he looked at the sentence. And for the first time since entering the boardroom, his expression changed. The laughter faded slowly, but the smiles remained. Around the conference table, executives settled back into their seats, still convinced they were watching a harmless joke unfold. Victor Sterling folded his arms and leaned against the edge of the table. The billionaire chief executive officer looked entirely comfortable. This was his room, his company, his meeting, and as far as he was concerned, Ethan Walker was simply a janitor standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yet Ethan continued staring at the sentence displayed on the giant screen. The room expected embarrassment. Instead, they saw concentration. Claire Mitchell noticed it immediately. His eyes moved across the text with unusual familiarity. Not confusion, not curiosity, familiarity. That realization sent a small chill through her. Ethan remained silent for several seconds. The boardroom grew impatient. One executive glanced at his watch. Another smirked openly. "Well," Victor asked, "what do you think?" Ethan looked away from the screen. "I think your translators have a difficult problem." More laughter followed. Victor grinned. "At least we agree on something." Ethan nodded politely. The sentence appears simple. He glanced back toward the screen. But it is not actually written to be translated word for word. The room quieted slightly. Claire straightened in her chair. Victor raised an eyebrow. "And how would you know that?" Ethan looked toward him. "Because that would destroy the meaning." For the first time, several executives stopped smiling. Ethan's answer sounded oddly specific. Victor noticed the shift and laughed again. "Interesting." He pointed toward the screen. "Go ahead. Explain it." Ethan hesitated. "I should probably get back to work." "No," Victor replied. "You have our attention now." The board members chuckled softly. Ethan looked around the room. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the afternoon sunlight across polished surfaces. Expensive suits surrounded him. Degrees from elite universities decorated the walls. People who managed billions of dollars waited for a janitor to continue speaking. The irony was not lost on him. "The phrase is being interpreted as a legal guarantee," Ethan finally said. "That is why your translation teams disagree." Claire's eyes widened slightly. That was exactly where the dispute had begun. Ethan continued. "But in its original context, it functions more as a declaration of mutual obligation than a contractual promise." Silence settled over part of the room. One attorney leaned forward. "How do you know that?" Ethan immediately shook his head. "I could be wrong." Victor smiled. "That sounds less confident than your first answer." Ethan glanced down. "I have learned to be careful when discussing languages." The statement sounded strange. Not because of the words. Because of the way he said them. Like someone speaking from experience. Claire studied him carefully. Something about this entire situation felt increasingly unusual. Victor walked toward the screen and tapped the highlighted sentence. "Then tell us what it actually means." Ethan remained silent. Several seconds passed. The room waited. Then his phone vibrated inside his pocket. He glanced at it briefly. A message appeared on the screen. "School play starts at 6. Do not be late, Dad." A small smile touched his face. Claire noticed that too. Whatever confidence Ethan possessed seemed to appear only when he looked at that message. He slipped the phone away. "Everything okay?" Victor asked. "My daughter," Ethan replied. "She has a performance tonight." Victor nodded distractedly. "Wonderful. Now what about the sentence?" Ethan looked back toward the screen. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of answering, he asked a question. "Has anyone shown you the paragraph before it?" Several executives exchanged confused looks. One attorney shook his head. The translators focused on the disputed sentence. Ethan nodded slowly. "That explains the problem." Claire felt her pulse quicken. "Why?" Ethan pointed toward the document. "Because the sentence is incomplete without the context above it." Complete silence followed. No laughter this time. No jokes. The room suddenly felt different. Victor stared at him. "You have read documents from this language before?" Ethan smiled faintly. "A few." Claire noticed several executives looking at one another. The confidence in Ethan's voice no longer sounded accidental. It sounded earned. Outside the windows, clouds drifted across the Chicago skyline. Inside the boardroom, a different kind of storm was beginning to form. Victor walked slowly back toward his chair. "Tell me something, Mr. Walker." Ethan waited. How does a janitor know any of this? The question hung in the air. Everyone wanted the answer. Claire most of all. Ethan looked around the room. Then he glanced once more at the message from his daughter waiting on his phone. A warmth appeared in his eyes that had been absent before. "That," he said quietly, "is a much longer story than this meeting has time for." The boardroom remained unusually quiet after Ethan Walker's answer. The jokes had disappeared. The laughter had vanished. Yet nobody seemed willing to admit that the atmosphere had changed. Victor Sterling settled back into his chair and tapped a pen against the polished table. The billionaire chief executive officer had spent his entire career controlling rooms exactly like this one. He was not accustomed to mysteries, especially mysteries wearing a janitor's uniform. A longer story? Victor repeated. That sounds convenient. A few executives chuckled politely, though the laughter lacked confidence this time. Ethan nodded. Most true stories are. Claire Mitchell lowered her eyes briefly to hide a smile. The answer was simple, but it carried an unexpected weight. Ethan was not trying to impress anyone. That was becoming increasingly obvious. If anything, he seemed eager to leave. Unfortunately for him, nobody in the room wanted him to leave anymore. Victor gestured toward an empty chair along the wall. Sit down. Ethan blinked. Sir, you heard me. Victor folded his arms. For someone who claims to know something our consultants missed, you might as well stay for a few minutes. Ethan glanced toward his cleaning cart. I still have work to finish. The building will survive. More executives smiled. Ethan hesitated before finally taking the empty chair. It was the first time anyone in that room had invited him to sit. The irony did not escape Claire. For nearly 3 years, Ethan had cleaned offices throughout Sterling Global. Thousands of employees passed him every week. Yet nobody had ever asked him to join a conversation. Outside the towering windows, the afternoon sun drifted lower across the Chicago skyline. Long shadows stretched across conference materials and expensive suits. The room looked exactly the same as it had 30 minutes earlier. Yet everything felt different. Victor pointed toward the document again. Explain something to me. Ethan waited. You recognized a contextual problem in less than 10 seconds. Victor leaned forward. How? Ethan considered the question carefully. Experience. Experience doing what? Another pause followed. Ethan looked down at his hands. Years of work had left small marks across them. Not the hands people expected to see attached to someone discussing international linguistic disputes. Reading. A few executives exchanged confused looks. Victor laughed. Reading? Ethan nodded. A lot of reading. The answer generated more confusion than clarity. Claire noticed that Ethan consistently avoided discussing himself directly. Every answer seemed designed to reveal as little as possible. That alone made her more curious. Most people offered credentials at the first opportunity. Ethan seemed determined to hide his. One of the attorneys spoke up. Mr. Walker, have you studied foreign languages? Ethan smiled faintly. A few. How many? Enough. The room fell silent again. Several executives looked mildly frustrated. Ethan was answering every question while somehow revealing almost nothing. Victor shook his head. You know, this would be much easier if you simply told us what your background is. Ethan looked toward the giant windows. For a moment, his reflection stared back at him from the glass. Then his phone vibrated again. Another message from his daughter. Good luck at work today, Dad. Do not forget 6 o'clock. A softness entered his eyes immediately. Claire noticed it. So did Victor. Your daughter again? Victor asked. Ethan nodded. She has a theater performance tonight. Important role? Ethan smiled. To her, it is the most important role in the world. Something about the answer caused several people around the table to relax slightly. For the first time, they were not looking at a mystery. They were looking at a father. Claire found herself wondering what his daughter was like. More importantly, she found herself wondering what circumstances had placed a man like Ethan behind a cleaning cart. The question refused to leave her mind. The meeting resumed, though not quite as before. Executives continued discussing the international agreement. Attorneys reviewed language. Analysts compared interpretations. Yet every few minutes someone glanced toward Ethan. They could not help it. The invisible man was invisible no longer. Eventually, Claire opened a digital file on her tablet. Curiosity had finally overcome restraint. She entered Ethan Walker's employee information into the company database. The screen loaded slowly. Position, facilities maintenance. Employment status, full-time. Standard records appeared first. Then her eyes narrowed. There was something unusual. A section of his employment history had been marked confidential by executive authorization years earlier. Claire frowned. That was highly unusual for a janitor. Very unusual. She clicked deeper into the file. Access denied. Her pulse quickened slightly. Across the room, Ethan continued listening quietly while executives debated translations worth billions of dollars. He looked perfectly comfortable. Not impressed. Not intimidated. Comfortable. As though boardrooms and billion-dollar discussions were environments he understood far better than anyone in the room realized. And for the first time, Claire Mitchell began to suspect that Ethan Walker's longer story might be far more extraordinary than anyone was prepared to believe. The afternoon sunlight continued sliding across the glass walls of the boardroom as the meeting moved into its 7th hour. What had begun as a routine negotiation had evolved into something far stranger. The international agreement remained stalled. Billions of dollars waited on the meaning of a single disputed passage. And somehow, a janitor had become the most interesting person in the room. Ethan Walker sat quietly in the chair near the wall while executives debated interpretations that seemed to grow more complicated with every passing minute. He had stopped speaking entirely. That alone made people more curious. Human nature often works that way. The less someone says, the more everyone wants to hear. Victor Sterling drummed his fingers against the polished conference table. Patience had never been one of his strengths. "Let us stop circling the problem," he finally said. "We need answers." A senior attorney nodded. "The Overseas Consortium insists the language creates a moral obligation." Another executive disagreed immediately. "Our translators believe it creates a legal obligation." A third shook his head. Others argue it is symbolic. Frustration spread through the room again. Claire Mitchell watched the argument carefully. Then she looked toward Ethan. He remained calm. Not because he had solved the problem. Because he seemed to understand it. The distinction mattered. Claire had spent years negotiating international agreements. She knew what confidence looked like. Ethan was not guessing. He was waiting. Victor noticed her glance. "You keep looking at him." Claire did not deny it. Because he reacted to the document before anyone explained the issue. Several heads turned toward Ethan again. Victor sighed. "Fine." He leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Walker, indulge us. If context matters so much, what are we missing?" Ethan remained silent for a moment. Outside the windows, helicopters moved across the skyline, while traffic crawled through the streets far below. The city seemed distant from the tension inside the boardroom. Finally, Ethan stood and walked toward the giant display screen. The movement alone changed the atmosphere. A few executives exchanged uncertain looks. For the first time all day, Ethan appeared completely comfortable. He studied the document projected across the wall. Then he pointed toward a paragraph several lines above the disputed sentence. "There." The room followed his finger. "What about it?" Victor asked. Ethan looked at the screen. "The translators are focusing on individual words." He paused. The author was focused on relationships. Silence settled over the room. Ethan continued. "This section was written by someone trained in classical diplomatic language." Several attorneys frowned. Victor folded his arms. "And?" Ethan pointed again. "The disputed sentence is not making a demand." He moved his finger upward. "It is referencing an obligation already established here." Claire's pulse quickened. She immediately reopened her notes. Ethan continued speaking in a calm, measured voice. "Remove the earlier paragraph, and the sentence becomes confusing." He glanced around the room. "Keep the paragraph, and the meaning becomes obvious." One executive leaned forward. "Obvious how?" Ethan looked back at the screen. "The document is asking both parties to protect a mutual partnership, not promising legal enforcement." The room fell completely silent. Nobody laughed. Nobody interrupted. Several attorneys began reviewing documents simultaneously. Fingers moved rapidly across keyboards. Claire compared the language against her own notes. Then she slowly lowered her tablet. Ethan was right. The interpretation aligned perfectly with the surrounding context. Victor noticed her reaction immediately. "You agree with him?" Claire looked up. "I think he may have solved the entire dispute." Those words landed heavily. Around the table, executives exchanged stunned expressions. The senior attorney adjusted his glasses. That interpretation would remove the primary obstacle to the acquisition. Another executive nodded. "And it matches the cultural guidance our consultants provided weeks ago." The realization spread gradually across the room, like sunlight reaching dark corners. Ethan had not simply offered an opinion. He had connected pieces that highly paid specialists had failed to connect. Victor stared at him. For the first time since the meeting began, the billionaire looked genuinely unsettled. "Who are you?" The question emerged almost as a whisper. Ethan smiled faintly. "I clean offices." A few people almost laughed, but nobody actually did. The answer no longer sounded believable. Claire studied him carefully. The confidential file. The unusual observations. The effortless understanding of a highly specialized document. The pieces refused to fit together. Ethan glanced at his watch. 5 o'clock. His daughter's theater performance was getting closer. If there is nothing else, he said politely, I should finish my shift. The room remained frozen. Victor Sterling, who normally controlled every conversation he entered, seemed unable to respond. Ethan turned toward his cleaning cart near the door. Then the chief executive finally spoke. No, Ethan stopped. Victor stood slowly from his chair. I think your longer story just became the most important thing in this building. For several long seconds after Victor Sterling spoke, nobody moved. The boardroom seemed suspended between two realities. In one reality, Ethan Walker was still the janitor who emptied trash bins and polished conference tables after everyone went home. In the other, he had just untangled a problem that had frustrated elite attorneys, consultants, and executives for weeks. Neither reality seemed capable of fully explaining the man standing beside the cleaning cart. Ethan looked at the clock on the wall. 5 o'clock and 12 minutes. Every passing minute mattered. His daughter would be stepping onto a stage in less than an hour. Yet the room refused to let him leave. Victor slowly walked around the conference table. You solved the central dispute in a $2 billion acquisition. Ethan shook his head. I offered an interpretation. An interpretation our experts missed. That happens sometimes. The answer sounded so ordinary that several executives stared at him in disbelief. Claire Mitchell continued studying him carefully. She had spent years around powerful people. Most successful individuals carried their achievements like badges. Ethan carried his knowledge like a secret. Victor stopped directly across from him. Mr. Walker, I am going to ask you something one more time. Ethan waited patiently. Who are you? The room fell silent again. Outside the glass walls, the sun dipped lower across the Chicago skyline, bathing the city in shades of gold and amber. Ethan looked toward the windows. For a moment, he seemed far away. Then he smiled faintly. I am a father. Several executives exchanged confused looks. Victor sighed. That is not what I meant. It is the most important answer I have. Something about the way he said it prevented anyone from laughing. Claire felt an unexpected weight in those words. They were not defensive. They were true. One of the board members leaned forward. You clearly have training. Ethan nodded once. Yes. Where? Different places. What kind of training? Ethan hesitated. Languages. The answer only deepened the mystery. Victor looked toward Claire. You found something in his file, did you not? Claire considered the question carefully. Only that parts of it are restricted. That immediately captured everyone's attention. Restricted? One executive repeated. Claire nodded. Executive authorization. Victor frowned. I certainly did not authorize it. Claire met his eyes. The authorization predates your current human resources system. Silence followed. Ethan looked mildly uncomfortable. The discussion was moving somewhere he clearly did not want it to go. Victor noticed. You do not seem surprised. Ethan smiled. No, would you like to explain why? Ethan glanced at the clock again. 5:15. His daughter's performance moved closer with every passing second. He reached into his pocket and looked briefly at a photograph on his phone. A teenage girl standing beneath stage lights during a rehearsal. The smile on his face softened instantly. Claire saw it. So did Victor. The billionaire suddenly understood something important. Ethan helped because help was needed. The distinction was impossible to ignore once seen. A notification suddenly appeared on Claire's tablet. An automated archival search had completed. Her pulse quickened immediately. She opened the file. Several scanned records surfaced from years earlier. At first glance, they appeared unrelated to Sterling Global. Then she noticed a name. Ethan Walker. Her eyes widened. Another document loaded. Then another. Academic publications. International conferences. Research journals. Language institutes. Claire stared at the screen in disbelief. The room continued discussing the acquisition while she silently reviewed page after page. Every new document made less sense than the last. Finally, Victor noticed her expression. Claire. She looked up slowly. I think I found something. Every head turned toward her. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Not in fear. Not in panic. More like someone recognizing a moment that had finally arrived. Claire swallowed carefully. I do not think Mr. Walker used to work in maintenance. The room became perfectly still. Victor folded his arms. Then where did he work? Claire looked back at the documents. The answer seemed impossible. She checked twice, then a third time. The records remained unchanged. According to these archives, she said quietly, Mr. Walker spent years as one of the most respected linguistic researchers in the country. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sound came from the distant hum of the building's air system. Victor stared at Ethan. Several executives looked genuinely stunned. Ethan remained calm, completely calm. Then he slipped his phone back into his pocket and looked toward the clock once more. 5:17. That title belonged to someone else a long time ago, he said softly. Now, if you will excuse me, my daughter has a performance, and she is counting on me to be there. The boardroom remained frozen long after Ethan Walker finished speaking. Nobody seemed prepared for the simple way he had delivered the revelation. There had been no dramatic announcement, no attempt to impress anyone. Claire Mitchell had uncovered a history that could have filled books, yet Ethan treated it like an old photograph stored in a forgotten drawer. Victor Sterling stared at him across the conference room. One of the most respected linguistic researchers in the country, he repeated. Claire nodded slowly. The records are legitimate. She turned her tablet towards several board members. Published research, international advisory work, academic appointments, multiple language institutions. The executives examined the documents in stunned silence. Ethan looked toward the windows again. The sky outside had shifted into deeper shades of orange and gold. Time was moving. Too quickly. His daughter's performance would begin soon. Victor shook his head. This makes absolutely no sense. Ethan smiled politely. It does if you know the whole story. Then tell us. The request came from one of the senior board members. Another executive nodded. Please. For the first time all afternoon, the room was not asking him to solve a business problem. They were asking him to explain himself. Ethan remained silent for several moments. His eyes drifted briefly toward the photograph on his phone. Then he looked around the room. Many years ago, he said quietly, I spent most of my life studying languages. Nobody interrupted. I love the work. I love the research. I loved discovering how different cultures expressed the same human emotions. His voice remained calm. I traveled constantly. Conferences, universities, international projects. Claire listened carefully. The room seemed smaller now, more personal. Ethan continued. At the time, I thought I was building the perfect career. Victor folded his arms. What happened? Ethan smiled faintly. Life happened. A few people exchanged curious glances. Ethan looked toward the fading sunlight beyond the windows. My wife became sick. The room grew even quieter. Suddenly, none of those conferences mattered very much. His voice never wavered. The publications did not matter. The awards did not matter. The travel did not matter. Claire lowered her eyes. She already knew where the story was going. Ethan continued. The only thing that mattered was my family. Nobody spoke. The air itself seemed heavier. For a while we managed. He paused. Then we did not. The sentence landed softly, yet everyone understood. Ethan glanced at the photograph of his daughter once more. After that, there was only Sophie and me. Several executives looked away briefly. Even Victor Sterling seemed uncomfortable. Ethan was not telling the story for sympathy. That was what made it powerful. He was simply explaining facts. Raising a child alone changes your priorities. He smiled. Especially when that child needs stability more than she needs impressive stories about her father traveling around the world. Claire felt something tighten in her chest. Ethan continued. I received offers to continue my work. Why did you not accept them? One board member asked quietly. Ethan answered immediately. Because every offer required me to leave. Silence followed. Different cities, different countries, different schedules. He shook his head. Sophie had already lost enough. The room sat motionless. Ethan looked around the conference table. Children remember who was there. The words settled over everyone like a blanket of truth. I decided I wanted her to remember me. Nobody laughed. Nobody checked their phones. Nobody looked at financial reports. For the first time all day, the acquisition, the negotiations, and the billions of dollars seemed strangely unimportant. Ethan glanced at the clock. 5:24. His expression softened. So I stayed. Victor stared at him. You walked away from everything? Ethan smiled. Not everything. Another pause. I kept the most important part. The room understood immediately. Claire looked toward the photograph still visible on his phone screen. A young girl smiling beneath stage lights. Ethan had not sacrificed his life. He had exchanged one version of success for another. Suddenly, the mystery disappeared. The janitor, the scholar, the father, they were all the same person. Victor slowly sat down. For perhaps the first time in years, the billionaire looked genuinely humbled. And now you clean offices. Ethan nodded. And attend school plays. A few people smiled. Not because the answer was funny. Because it was beautiful in its simplicity. The clock continued moving forward. 5:25. Ethan picked up the handle of his cleaning cart. If there is nothing else, I really should go. This time nobody stopped him immediately. The room simply watched. Watched a man who had once stood at the top of an academic field choose to leave a boardroom full of power because a teenager was waiting for her father to show up. And somehow, that decision impressed them more than every achievement listed in Claire's files combined. The boardroom remained silent as Ethan Walker wrapped his fingers around the handle of the cleaning cart. The atmosphere had changed so completely that it no longer resembled the room he had entered earlier that afternoon. Hours ago, people had barely acknowledged his existence. Now dozens of eyes followed his every movement. Yet Ethan seemed unaffected by the attention. He looked at the clock once more. 5:27. His daughter would be stepping backstage soon. That was the only deadline that mattered to him. He began pushing the cart toward the door. Mr. Walker. Victor Sterling's voice stopped him again. Ethan turned patiently. There was no irritation in his expression. No frustration. Just patience. Victor stood near the head of the conference table, hands resting on the polished wood surface. For the first time all day, the billionaire looked uncertain. I owe you an apology. The room became even quieter. Several executives looked surprised. Victor Sterling was not known for apologizing. Ethan smiled gently. There is no need. There is. Victor glanced briefly around the room. I judged you before I knew anything about you. Ethan nodded once. Most people do. The answer was delivered without bitterness, without accusation. That somehow made it more powerful. Claire Mitchell watched the exchange carefully. She could see the effect Ethan was having on everyone around him. Not because of his intelligence, not because of his accomplishments, because he carried no resentment. Most people would have enjoyed this moment. Most people would have used it to settle old scores. Ethan seemed interested only in getting to his daughter's performance on time. Victor shook his head. You solved a problem that cost us weeks of work. Ethan looked toward the boardroom windows where the evening sky glowed amber above Chicago. Then I am glad I could help. Why? Victor asked. The question surprised everyone. Ethan paused. Why what? Why help people who were laughing at you? The room froze. Nobody wanted to interrupt. Ethan considered the question carefully. Then he smiled. Because the problem was real. Victor frowned slightly. Ethan continued. Their opinions about me had nothing to do with the problem. Several executives lowered their eyes. Claire felt the weight of those words settle across the room. Ethan was describing something most people never learned. Pride often turns every disagreement into a personal battle. Ethan had simply separated the problem from the people. Victor remained silent. Ethan continued. When someone asks for help, you help if you can. Even if they do not respect you? Ethan smiled. Respect is nice. He glanced briefly at the photograph on his phone. But it is not the reason to do the right thing. No one spoke. The room had become a classroom without realizing it. The janitor was teaching lessons no executive training seminar could replicate. Claire found herself thinking about the countless leadership conferences she had attended throughout her career. None of them had contained wisdom as simple or as honest as the words Ethan had spoken in the last 5 minutes. One of the board members cleared his throat. Mr. Walker, if you do not mind me asking, how many languages do you actually speak? Ethan laughed softly. The sound surprised everyone. It was the first relaxed laugh they had heard from him all day. Enough to know that translation is never really about words. The executive smiled. What is it about? Ethan answered immediately. People. Several members of the board exchanged thoughtful looks. Ethan continued. Every language is just a different way of expressing the same hopes, fears, dreams, and responsibilities. Claire could almost see the room changing around him. The executives who had spent years focused on profits, mergers, and quarterly reports were suddenly listening to a janitor discuss human connection. And they were listening carefully. Victor looked toward the giant screen where the disputed sentence still remained projected. Hours earlier it had represented frustration and conflict. Now it seemed almost insignificant. You know, Victor said quietly. We pay consultants millions of dollars to advise us. Ethan raised an eyebrow. That sounds expensive. A ripple of genuine laughter moved around the room. For the first time all afternoon, the laughter carried warmth instead of mockery. Victor smiled despite himself. It is. Ethan nodded. Then I hope they are helpful. More laughter followed. Claire checked the time. 5:30. She immediately looked toward Ethan. He noticed. I should really go. Nobody argued. Nobody stopped him. The room understood. Ethan began moving toward the door again. This time the board members stood almost instinctively as he passed. Not because anyone instructed them to. Not because of company protocol. Because respect had arrived naturally. Ethan paused near the exit and looked back one final time. The billion-dollar acquisition would likely move forward. The boardroom crisis was ending. The executives would remember this meeting for years. Yet Ethan's thoughts were already somewhere else entirely. Somewhere beyond the glass towers, beyond the negotiations, beyond the city itself. A small theater stage. Bright lights. A nervous teenager waiting behind a curtain. And as he stepped through the doorway, everyone in the room realized the most extraordinary thing about Ethan Walker was not that he had once been a brilliant scholar. It was that he had never regretted choosing his daughter instead. The elevator doors closed behind Ethan Walker with a soft metallic sound. For the first time all afternoon, he was alone. The silence felt almost unfamiliar after hours inside the boardroom. He stood beside his cleaning cart as the elevator descended through 42 floors of polished corporate power. Reflections shimmered across the stainless steel walls. Numbers flashed steadily downward. 40, 39, 38. Ethan glanced at his watch. 5:34. He still had enough time. Barely. A small smile crossed his face. Sophie would probably be checking her phone every few minutes by now. She always did before performances. Not because she doubted him. Because she cared. The elevator reached the lobby. Ethan stepped out and pushed the cart toward the maintenance area. Employees passed him without recognizing that anything extraordinary had happened upstairs. A few nodded politely. Others hurried toward meetings. The world continued moving exactly as it had before. Ethan preferred it that way. He parked the cart in its storage area, signed out for the evening, and exchanged a brief greeting with another facilities employee preparing for the night shift. Big plans tonight? The man asked. Ethan smiled. My daughter has a performance. Would not miss it. Ethan laughed softly. Not a chance. The answer came so quickly that it sounded automatic. Because it was. Minutes later, Ethan stepped outside the glass tower into the cool Chicago evening. The city glowed beneath the fading colors of sunset. Traffic moved through the streets. Office workers streamed from surrounding buildings. The skyline reflected gold, orange, and purple across polished surfaces. Ethan took a deep breath and started walking toward the parking garage. Behind him, 40 floors above the city, something unexpected was happening. The boardroom had not resumed business as usual. Nobody seemed capable of returning immediately to spreadsheets and negotiations. The atmosphere remained changed. Claire Mitchell stood near the giant windows, staring out across the skyline. Victor Sterling remained seated at the head of the conference table. Several executives continued reviewing Ethan's archived records. Every document seemed to reveal another accomplishment, another publication, another international recognition, another example of a career that most people would consider remarkable, yet none of it explained the part that fascinated them most. Why he had walked away. One board member shook his head slowly. I still do not understand it. Claire looked up. What? Giving all of this up? He gestured toward the files. Most people spend their entire lives trying to build a reputation like this. Victor remained unusually quiet. Claire closed one of the archive documents. Maybe he did not see it as giving something up. The room considered that. Then what was it? Another executive asked. Claire looked toward the empty chair where Ethan had been sitting. Maybe he saw it as choosing something else. Silence followed. Victor slowly leaned back in his chair. The answer seemed obvious now. Yet nobody in the room had thought of it before. They had spent their careers measuring success through promotions, valuations, acquisitions, and influence. Ethan had measured success differently. The realization was uncomfortable, which was precisely why it mattered. Meanwhile, Ethan entered the parking garage and climbed into an aging pickup truck that had seen better years. The vehicle was clean but modest. The kind of truck nobody noticed. He started the engine and checked the time. 5:38. Then his phone vibrated. A new message appeared. Are you coming? Ethan smiled immediately and dictated a response through the vehicle system. Already on my way. Save me a good seat. 3 dots appeared almost instantly. Then another message. Front row only. Ethan laughed out loud. The sound filled the quiet truck. For a moment, the stress of the day disappeared completely. The boardroom, the executives, the billion-dollar acquisition. None of it mattered as much as that simple conversation. Traffic moved steadily as he headed toward the community performing arts center across town. The evening sky darkened gradually overhead. Streetlights flickered on. Music played softly through the speakers. Ethan drove with the calm confidence of someone exactly where he needed to be. Several miles away, Claire finally gathered her things and left the boardroom. Yet instead of heading home, she stopped by the archives department. Curiosity still lingered. Something about Ethan's story felt unfinished. She requested additional historical records. The archivist frowned. These are old. How old? Claire asked. More than 15 years. A few minutes later, another file appeared. Claire opened it. Her eyes widened almost immediately. There, buried inside an academic profile, was a photograph of a much younger Ethan Walker standing beside diplomats, scholars, and government officials from multiple countries. Beneath the image appeared a title that made her stop breathing for a second. Not researcher. Not consultant. Something far more significant. Claire stared at the screen. Then she looked back toward the city skyline visible beyond the office windows. The mystery was not getting smaller. It was getting bigger. Much bigger. And for the first time, she began to suspect that even Ethan's explanation in the boardroom had revealed only part of the truth. Chicago's evening traffic moved steadily beneath a sky painted with fading shades of orange and blue as Ethan Walker guided his old pickup truck through the city. The dashboard clock read 5:47. Every red light felt longer than usual. Every intersection seemed determined to test his patience. Yet Ethan never looked worried. He had spent years mastering something more difficult than languages. He had learned how to trust that showing up consistently mattered more than arriving perfectly. His phone buzzed again through the hands-free system. A new message appeared. We are lining up backstage. Ethan smiled immediately. You will be great. Another message arrived seconds later. What if I forget my lines? Ethan laughed softly. Then he dictated his response. Then smile and keep going. That is what you always tell me. A few seconds passed. Then her answer appeared. Fair point. The exchange filled the truck with warmth. Outside, the city continued rushing toward evening. Inside, a father and daughter shared a conversation that neither would remember word for word years later, yet both would remember forever. Several miles away, Claire Mitchell remained seated in the archives office. The newly uncovered file lay open before her. She had reviewed it 3 times already. The words still seemed difficult to believe. Ethan Walker had not merely been a respected researcher. The records described someone whose expertise had once influenced negotiations between governments, multinational organizations, and cultural institutions across multiple continents. Claire stared at a photograph of a younger Ethan standing among diplomats from 6 different countries. His posture looked exactly the same as it did today. Calm, quiet, observant. Yet the title beneath the image changed everything. Senior Cultural Language Advisor. International Mediation Specialist. Claire leaned back in her chair. That was not an academic position. That was a role entrusted to people capable of navigating conversations where a single misunderstanding could damage relationships between nations. Suddenly, Ethan's effortless understanding of the disputed document made far more sense. Claire continued reading. Awards. Recognition. Published works translated into multiple languages. Invitations from prestigious institutions around the world. Then she reached the final section. Career departure. No scandal. No controversy. No professional failure. Just a simple note indicating voluntary withdrawal from international work following a family medical crisis. Claire slowly closed her eyes. Ethan had not lost his career. He had chosen to leave it. The distinction felt enormous. Across town, Victor Sterling sat alone in the boardroom long after most executives had gone home. The giant screen had finally been turned off. The disputed sentence no longer dominated the room. The acquisition team had already begun moving forward using Ethan's interpretation. The crisis was ending. Yet Victor found himself thinking about something else entirely. His eyes drifted toward the empty chair near the wall. Earlier that afternoon, he had used Ethan as the punchline of a joke. The memory now felt uncomfortable. Not because Ethan had proven him wrong, because Ethan had never tried to prove anyone wrong at all. Victor picked up one of the archive profiles Claire had forwarded. He read through the accomplishments again. Then he stopped at a photograph showing Ethan holding a small child many years earlier. Sophie. Even in the old picture, the expression on Ethan's face looked familiar. The same expression he carried when talking about her today. Victor stared at the image longer than expected. Finally, he whispered something to the empty room. You chose her. The realization settled heavily. Most people said family came first. Ethan had actually lived it. Meanwhile, Ethan pulled into the parking lot of the Community Performing Arts Center. The building glowed beneath bright exterior lights. Families hurried toward the entrance carrying flowers and cameras. Children in costumes peeked through glass doors while volunteers directed guests inside. Ethan checked the time. 5:56. He had made it. He grabbed his jacket and headed toward the entrance. As he stepped inside, the familiar scent of stage makeup, fresh programs, and nervous excitement filled the air. Parents gathered in clusters. Teachers rushed between rooms. Students prepared backstage. Everything felt wonderfully chaotic. Ethan's phone buzzed one more time. Where are you? He typed back immediately. Turn around. Several yards away, a teenager. You made it, Sophie said. Of course I did. I was worried. Ethan smiled. I promised. Sophie stepped back and looked at him carefully. Long day. Ethan laughed. You have no idea. She smiled. Good. You can tell me afterward. Then she grabbed his hand and started pulling him toward the auditorium. Come on. I saved your seat. Ethan followed willingly. Behind them, the doors closed against the evening air. Ahead of them waited bright stage lights, a nervous young performer, and a promise kept. Neither of them knew that elsewhere in the city, people were still trying to understand who Ethan Walker really was. But for Ethan, the answer had never been complicated. The auditorium lights dimmed gradually as families settled into their seats. Conversations softened into whispers. Programs rustled quietly. The anticipation that always exists before a performance seemed to fill every corner of the room. Ethan Walker sat in the front row exactly where Sophie had wanted him. The seat was not comfortable. The view was not perfect. Yet to Ethan, it felt like the best seat in the world. He looked toward the stage and smiled. Behind the curtain, dozens of students were probably experiencing the familiar mixture of excitement and fear that accompanies any public performance. Sophie was undoubtedly among them. Somewhere backstage, she was checking her costume, reviewing her lines, and trying not to worry. Ethan knew her well enough to picture it exactly. The house lights faded completely. A spotlight illuminated the center of the stage. Applause filled the auditorium as the performance began. Meanwhile, across the city, activity continued inside Sterling Global headquarters. The boardroom had finally emptied, but the story of Ethan Walker had not. Claire Mitchell remained in her office overlooking downtown Chicago. The file she had uncovered sat open on her desk beside several additional records she had requested from archival storage. Every new document revealed another layer of a life Ethan seemed determined to leave behind. Yet none of the records suggested arrogance. None suggested ambition. If anything, they suggested the opposite. The more accomplished Ethan became, the less interested he seemed in recognition. Claire found that detail impossible to ignore. Her phone suddenly rang. The caller identification displayed Victor Sterling. She answered immediately. Still working? Victor asked. Claire looked at the files spread across her desk. Apparently. Victor laughed softly. I keep thinking about him. Claire understood exactly what he meant. So do I. A brief silence followed. Then Victor spoke again. Did you find anything else? Claire glanced toward the newest document. Actually, yes. And Claire leaned back slowly. The international consortium we have been negotiating with. What about them? One of their senior advisors worked with Ethan years ago. Silence followed. Victor immediately understood the implication. You are serious. Completely. Claire reviewed the document again. Not only did they work together, the advisor specifically requested Ethan for multiple international projects. Victor exhaled slowly. We spent 6 weeks hiring consultants. I know. And the person who understood the document best was cleaning our boardroom. Claire smiled despite herself. That appears to be the situation. Across town, the performance continued beautifully. Music filled the auditorium. Young actors crossed the stage beneath bright lights. Parents watched proudly. Teachers observed from the wings. Ethan applauded enthusiastically after every scene involving Sophie. He was not pretending. To him, she genuinely was the most talented performer in the building. During one scene, Sophie glanced briefly toward the audience. Her eyes found him immediately. Ethan smiled and gave a small nod of encouragement. The nervousness vanished from her face at once. Claire would have understood the significance of that moment. So would Victor, because neither executive had ever witnessed what Ethan valued most. They knew the scholar, the translator, the expert. Only Sophie knew the father. The performance continued for nearly an hour. By the final scene, the audience was completely engaged. Laughter echoed through the auditorium. Applause followed emotional moments. Proud families captured photographs whenever possible. Ethan simply watched. Every sacrifice, every difficult decision, every opportunity declined, every professional title surrendered. Sitting there beneath the soft glow of stage lights, none of it felt like a sacrifice at all. Then the final curtain call arrived. Students lined the stage while applause thundered throughout the auditorium. Sophie stood among her classmates, smiling brightly beneath the lights. Ethan rose to his feet and joined the standing ovation. Not because the audience was standing, because his heart demanded it. Sophie spotted him immediately. Her smile widened even more. For a few seconds, the noise of the crowd seemed to disappear. There was only a father and daughter sharing a moment neither would forget. Several miles away, Claire closed another file. Then she noticed something she had missed earlier. A letter. Old. Archived. Written years before. She opened it carefully. The document appeared to be a recommendation written by a senior diplomat. Claire read the first paragraph. Then the second. Her eyes widened. By the time she reached the signature, she was staring at the page in disbelief. The recommendation described Ethan Walker using words rarely applied to anyone. Essential. Extraordinary. Irreplaceable. Claire slowly lowered the letter. Outside her office window, city lights shimmered against the darkening sky. Somewhere in Chicago, Ethan was probably celebrating his daughter's performance. Meanwhile, the people who had laughed at him that afternoon were only beginning to understand how extraordinary he truly was. And Claire had a growing suspicion that the biggest revelation had not yet arrived. The applause continued long after the final curtain closed. Families filled the aisles of the auditorium, gathering flowers, cameras, and excited children who could barely stop talking about the performance. Laughter echoed through the building. Proud parents congratulated one another. Teachers accepted grateful handshakes. The entire atmosphere felt warm and alive. Ethan Walker remained near the front row, smiling as he watched students stream off the stage and into the lobby. A few moments later, Sophie appeared through a side door, still wearing part of her costume. The instant she spotted him, she hurried across the room. "So," she asked, "how was I?" Ethan placed a hand over his heart. "I think Broadway should be worried." Sophie laughed. "Dad, I am serious. You always say that." Ethan nodded. "Because it is always true." She rolled her eyes playfully before hugging him again. Around them, families celebrated achievements both large and small. Yet to Ethan, no accomplishment in the room felt more important than seeing confidence shining in his daughter's eyes. For years he had worked quietly so moments like this could happen. And tonight, they had. As Sophie greeted friends and teachers, Ethan stepped aside near the edge of the lobby. His phone buzzed unexpectedly. The caller identification displayed a name he did not expect to see. Victor Sterling. Ethan stared at the screen for a second before answering. "Mr. Sterling." The billionaire's voice sounded unusually subdued. "I hope I am not interrupting." Ethan looked toward Sophie. "Not at all." A brief pause followed. "I wanted to thank you again." Ethan smiled. "You already did." "Not properly." Victor sounded thoughtful. "There are things I learned today that have nothing to do with business." Ethan leaned against the wall and listened. "That is good. Claire shared more of your records." Ethan laughed softly. "I was afraid she might." Victor hesitated. "Why did you never tell anyone?" The question felt familiar. Ethan had heard versions of it for years. "Tell them what?" "Who you were." Ethan looked toward Sophie again. She was laughing with several classmates beneath bright lobby lights. "Because that person stopped being important a long time ago." Victor was silent. Ethan continued. "People change. Most people would have used those accomplishments to open doors." Ethan smiled. The doors I cared about were already open. Across the city, Claire sat alone in her office with the diplomat's recommendation letter still resting on her desk. She had read it 4 times. Each reading revealed another detail she had overlooked. The letter described Ethan's ability to navigate conversations across cultures, resolve conflicts through understanding, and identify meaning where others saw confusion. Yet one paragraph stood out above all others. The diplomat had written that Ethan possessed a rare gift. Not language. Perspective. Claire stared at the sentence. Suddenly she understood something. Ethan had not solved the boardroom dispute because he knew more vocabulary than everyone else. He solved it because he listened differently. He looked for people instead of words. The realization felt profound. Meanwhile, Victor continued speaking. I have spent my entire life chasing success. Ethan listened quietly. Today I met someone who walked away from it. Ethan shook his head gently. No, Victor sounded confused. No, I did not walk away from success. Silence followed. Ethan smiled as he watched Sophie helping another student carry flowers to a table. I simply chose a different version of it. The words settled heavily between them. Victor understood immediately. One version of success had earned Ethan international recognition. The other had earned him moments like this. A daughter who looked for him in every audience. A daughter who believed promises would be kept. A daughter who never doubted he would show up. Suddenly the comparison seemed unfair. I think you won, Victor said quietly. Ethan laughed. Life is not a competition. Maybe not. Victor paused. But I still think you won. After ending the call, Ethan slipped his phone back into his pocket. Sophie immediately appeared beside him. Was that work? She asked. Something like that. You are not going back tonight, right? Ethan looked horrified. Absolutely not. Sophie smiled. Good answer. The two began walking toward the parking lot together. Behind them, the auditorium gradually emptied. Ahead of them stretched a calm Chicago evening. Neither noticed a message arriving in Claire's inbox at that exact moment. The sender was one of the international advisors involved in Sterling Global's acquisition. The subject line contained only 3 words. About Ethan Walker. Claire opened the message immediately. Then she stopped breathing for a moment. The advisor's first sentence read, If this is the same Ethan Walker I worked with years ago, your company may not realize that one of the most important negotiations in our organization's history succeeded because of him. Claire stared at the screen in disbelief. Somehow the story was still growing. And the more she learned, the more extraordinary Ethan appeared. Yet at that very moment, Ethan was not thinking about negotiations, honors, or accomplishments. He was listening to Sophie excitedly describe every detail of the evening. And to him, that conversation remained the greatest achievement of all. The drive home felt unusually peaceful. Chicago's skyline shimmered beneath the night sky, while traffic thinned across the city. Sophie sat in the passenger seat talking excitedly about the performance, replaying favorite moments, funny mistakes, and conversations with friends. Ethan listened with the same attention he once gave international conferences and diplomatic meetings. To him, her stories deserved no less respect. Every now and then he laughed. Every now and then he asked a question. And every time he did, Sophie smiled because she knew he was truly listening. Meanwhile, across the city, Claire Mitchell remained alone in her office long after most employees had gone home. The message from the international advisor stayed open on her screen. She read it again. Then again. The details seemed almost impossible. Years earlier, a complex negotiation involving multiple organizations had nearly collapsed because of a misunderstanding hidden within cultural language differences. Experts had failed to resolve it. Consultants had failed. Advisors had failed. According to the message, Ethan Walker had quietly stepped into the discussion and helped both sides understand one another without taking credit afterward. Claire leaned back in her chair. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Everywhere she looked, she found examples of Ethan solving problems and then disappearing before recognition arrived. Her phone rang unexpectedly. The caller identification displayed an overseas number. Claire answered cautiously. This is Claire Mitchell. A warm voice responded. Ms. Mitchell, my name is Daniel Laurent. I sent the message regarding Ethan Walker. Claire immediately sat upright. Thank you for contacting me. I was surprised to hear his name. Daniel laughed softly. It has been many years. Claire hesitated before asking the question that had been building all evening. Was he really as respected as these records suggest? Silence followed for a moment. Then Daniel answered. The records do not tell the full story. Claire stared out her office window at the city lights. What do you mean? Many people are intelligent. Many people are educated. Ethan was different. Daniel paused. He understood people. Claire had heard something similar before. The diplomat's letter. Ethan's own comments. The repeated theme continued appearing. Daniel continued. He could enter a room full of disagreement and somehow help everyone feel heard. Claire glanced toward the boardroom, visible through the glass walls across the hallway. Earlier that day, Ethan had done exactly that. Why did he leave? She asked quietly. Daniel's answer came immediately. His daughter. Claire closed her eyes. Of course. He spoke about her often? Constantly. Daniel laughed again. You could place him beside presidents, ambassadors, scholars, and business leaders. Within 10 minutes, he would be talking about his daughter. Claire smiled. The image felt perfectly consistent with the man she had met. Do you know something interesting? Daniel asked. What? People assumed Ethan sacrificed everything for his child. He paused. The truth is that he never viewed it that way. Claire remembered Ethan's words from earlier. I did not walk away from success. I simply chose a different version of it. Suddenly, the statement carried even greater meaning. Across town, Ethan and Sophie stopped at a small diner they occasionally visited after special events. Nothing fancy. Red booths. Warm lighting. Fresh pie displayed behind glass. The waitress recognized them immediately. Big night? She asked. Sophie grinned. The biggest. Ethan smiled. She was amazing. The waitress laughed. I had a feeling. As they settled into a booth, Sophie studied her father carefully. Something happened at work today. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Why do you think that? Because you have that look. He laughed softly. What look? The look you get when people finally figure something out. Ethan nearly choked on his coffee. Sophie smiled triumphantly. See? He shook his head in amusement. Sometimes she understood him better than anyone else. Back at Sterling Global headquarters, Claire finally shut down her computer. Before leaving, she walked through the darkened boardroom one last time. The room was empty now. Quiet. The giant screen was black. The polished table reflected only dim evening lights. Yet Claire could almost hear the laughter from earlier that afternoon. The assumptions. The judgments. The careless dismissals. Then she remembered the silence that followed. The silence after Ethan solved the problem. The silence after they learned who he was. The silence after they discovered what he had chosen. Claire stood near the chair Ethan had occupied and smiled faintly. Everyone in that room had entered the day believing they understood success. By evening, a janitor had quietly challenged every assumption they held. And the most remarkable part was that Ethan Walker would never know how profoundly he had changed them. Because while they were still trying to understand his story, he was exactly where he wanted to be all along. Later that night, after dinner and endless conversations about the performance, Ethan Walker and Sophie finally arrived home. Their small house sat on a quiet street where porch lights glowed softly against the darkness. The neighborhood was peaceful, familiar, safe. The kind of place built not with wealth, but with years of ordinary people caring about one another. Ethan unlocked the front door while Sophie continued describing every detail of her favorite scene. He listened carefully, just as he always did. Some people believed extraordinary lives were shaped by extraordinary moments. Ethan had learned something different. Life was usually shaped by ordinary moments repeated consistently over time. A conversation after school. A promise kept. A seat in the front row. A father showing up. Those moments rarely appeared important while they were happening. Yet they became the foundation of everything that mattered. Sophie eventually disappeared upstairs to prepare for bed. Ethan remained in the kitchen for a while, washing dishes and enjoying the quiet. The events of the day drifted through his mind. The boardroom. The negotiations. Victor Sterling. Claire Mitchell. The laughter. The questions. The surprise. He smiled faintly and shook his head. Life had a strange sense of humor sometimes. Then his phone vibrated. A message appeared from an unfamiliar number. Ethan opened it. Thank you again for today. The acquisition is moving forward. More importantly, I learned something valuable. Victor Sterling. Ethan stared at the message for a moment. Then he typed a simple response. Glad I could help. He set the phone aside and continued cleaning. No further explanation felt necessary. Across the city, Victor Sterling sat alone in his penthouse apartment overlooking Chicago. The lights of the skyline stretched endlessly beyond massive windows. Normally, he enjoyed the view. Tonight, he barely noticed it. His thoughts remained fixed on one man. A man who had entered his boardroom pushing a cleaning cart and left carrying a lesson no business school had ever taught him. Victor walked toward the window and stared down at the city below. Somewhere among millions of people, Ethan Walker was ending his evening without realizing the impact he had made. The billionaire found himself smiling. Not because a business deal had survived, because his definition of success had quietly shifted. Meanwhile, Claire Mitchell finally closed the last file and prepared to leave the office. Before shutting down her computer, she saved one final document, a simple folder labeled Ethan Walker. Not because she intended to investigate further, because some stories deserve to be remembered. As she turned off the lights and stepped into the hallway, she thought about the silence that had filled the boardroom after Ethan solved the translation problem. At first, she believed it was the silence of surprise. Later, she realized it was something else. It was respect arriving. Real respect. The kind that cannot be demanded. The kind that appears only when character reveals itself. Back at home, Ethan climbed the stairs and paused outside Sophie's room. The door remained slightly open. He glanced inside. Sophie had already fallen asleep with a theater program resting across her blanket. A small smile remained on her face. Ethan stood there quietly. For a long moment, he said nothing. The room was silent except for the gentle rhythm of peaceful sleep. Years ago, he had stood in conference halls filled with applause. He had received awards, recognition, invitations, praise from people whose names carried influence around the world. Yet none of those memories stirred his heart the way this simple scene did. He carefully stepped into the room and picked up the program so it would not fall onto the floor during the night. Then he pulled the blanket slightly higher over her shoulder. Sophie never woke. Ethan smiled and turned toward the doorway. Before leaving, he looked back one final time. The hallway light cast a soft glow across the room. Everything felt peaceful, complete. Certain victories make noise. Others arrive quietly. The world celebrates the loud ones. Promotions, titles, wealth, status, recognition. Yet the quiet victories are often the ones that matter most. A daughter who trusts her father. A promise kept. A life built around love instead of applause. Ethan switched off the hallway light and headed toward his own room. Outside, Chicago continued moving beneath the night sky. In towering offices and luxury apartments, people were still discussing the extraordinary man they had met that afternoon. Some talked about his intelligence. Others talked about his achievements. A few talked about the mystery of why he walked away from so much. They were all asking the wrong question. Ethan had never walked away from what mattered. He had walked toward it. And somewhere between a boardroom full of billion-dollar decisions and a front-row seat at a school performance, the truth had quietly revealed itself. The most important sentence Ethan Walker ever translated was not hidden inside an international contract. It was written across the choices he made every day. And when those choices were finally understood, the world around him fell silent.